everyone, and welcome to the Spatial Web AI podcast. This video is something I feel incredibly grateful to share with you today. While attending the International Workshop on Active Inference this past October, I had the great privilege of sitting down with world-renowned neuroscientist Dr. Karl Friston for an extended conversation. Interestingly enough, one of my questions for him was in regard to Yann LeCun, exactly 1 month before LeCun's departure from Meta. Yann is very familiar with Karl's work on active inference and the free energy principle. Yet in a conversation at the World Economic Forum in Davos more than a year prior, Yann was adamant that he agreed with Karl's direction, yet he insisted that we don't know any other way to train systems than deep learning. So I asked Karl why. What is it that Yann LeCun is missing? I also ran into Gary Marcus, who was on such a tight schedule that day, but was gracious enough to give me a few minutes for a short interview right before he went on stage with Karl for an interview discussion that was moderated by Tim Verbelen of Versus, who is one of the original organizers of the IWAI annual event. There's no formal intro to any of this footage. It was all shot on the fly as opportunities were arising. We simply drop into the conversations as they happened, and I've included all 3 of these segments, including the interview with Karl and Gary, moderated by Tim. And it's all in this one video that you're about to watch today. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to the International Workshop for Active Inference for welcoming me as a media partner this year, and for the extraordinary work that they do in bringing together the most brilliant minds in active inference from across the globe to share their cutting-edge research and exchange ideas. This is an event that has grown year over year, and I think it will continue to gain much attention as active inference gains more and more traction for its capabilities in fields like robotics and autonomous adaptive systems. I hope you enjoy these conversations as much as I did. Karl and Gary, thank you so much for your time and for so graciously entertaining my curiosities. So thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the video. It is my great pleasure to have a few moments with Dr. Karl Friston today to talk about what work he is doing and really leading in this entire active inference field. Karl, it's been a dream of mine to have a conversation with you for quite some time. And so I have some burning questions. You are at University College London, and Geoffrey Hinton also came from University College London. And while you were there, he was working on DeepMind. You were working on something called Nested Minds Network. And I know that some of my viewers are probably very curious. Why did you not join with DeepMind and what they were doing? What is it that made you want to pursue this active inference direction for AI, for autonomous intelligence?
That's a very challenging question to ask. But first of all, it's lovely to meet you in person. I read a lot of your material. It's nice to actually be able to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
So the history of this was we were located in Queen Square in the Bloomsbury area, the sort of intellectual heart of London, publishing and academic and actually clinical. We were briefed, and we were developing at that time state-of-the-art methods and analysis tools to understand the living brain using neuroimaging. And then fortuitously, Geoffrey Hinton arrived with Peter Dayan to direct the Gatsby Computational Neuroscience Unit, which was just next door. So we were academics. In fact, interestingly, Demis Hassabis, who subsequently became Sir Demis and got his Nobel Prize, was one of our PhD students. So he sort of learnt about the hippocampus working with Eleanor Maguire, with us doing theoretical neurobiology and again state-of-the-art image analysis procedures. And then he went off and founded Google DeepMind, and then asked Jeff actually to be an advisor. So that was, if you like, the divergence between academia, and industrial applications such as Google DeepMind. So it wasn't really a question of why did we not join Google DeepMind? We were just admiring spectators, and when I say we, to a certain extent, Geoffrey Hinton as well, who he had primarily an academic appointment. So our brief, both ourselves or myself and Jeff, was really to do theoretical work, advance the field, but also teach students and raise the next generation of theoreticians. And why? And I never see myself as diverging from Jeff, although I do see over the subsequent decade Jeff becoming somewhat seduced by the engineering power of deep RL, and it's as we see evinced in generative AI and large language models at the moment. To my mind, and I hope he never sees this, I think that was something of a distraction from the high road of doing it properly, and he certainly was inspirational in instantiating, certainly in me and a number of my colleagues, the basic principles of artificial intelligence, which of course are those of natural intelligence, which as brain imaging scientists, we were deeply invested in trying to unearth. And those notions at that time, when we were both in London, were focused very much on the notion of the brain as a generative model, as any intelligence basically working under a generative model that would explain the causes of the sensory inputs. So this is a very different use of the notion of generative models from generative AI.
Right.
So you could argue that generative AI, as understood in machine learning, is exactly the opposite of what Jeff was working on and what I have been working on since that time.
Which is really generating understanding, right? Generating
Precisely.
models of understanding. Yeah, very different. I tend to describe to people that right now what we're seeing with current AI, that it is the AI that is built for our current internet. Our current internet is websites, web domains, and applications, and you can generate content and use content, generate data, and that's what these AI are doing. They're generating content and doing things with data. But I feel like what you're working on with Active Inference, that's for what's coming with this new layer on the internet that takes us into spatial web and takes us into this grounding layer of context for these Active Inference AI models and agents that can then be distributed through networks. And I know that is deeply attributed to the white paper that you and Versus put out in, I think it was December of 22, on distributed ecosystems of intelligence. So do I have that right? Is that how you would describe it? Is there anything you would add to that?
Nothing I would add, but I'll certainly pick up. You used all my favorite words there, or some of my favorite words. So just pick up.
I'm sure I got them from you.
Well, some of them, not others not. But so just to pick up on a couple of things that you said there, which I think are absolutely key. You're talking about the next level, and I guess most people understand the next level as moving from AI to some kind of generalized or super intelligence, or as Versus likes to say, a universal intelligence. And what is that? Well, I think you said grounding. I think that's really important. Yeah. So to have an understanding of how your content was generated, that has to be grounded in meaning. So I think understanding and solving the grounding problem is basically the bright line between current generative AI that just generates content and the understanding that underwrites that and enables the right kind of message passing on the next generation of the World Wide Web, or certainly as that envisaged by the Spatial Web Foundation and as installed in the IEEE standards, for example. So what is that predicated on? I think you're absolutely right. It's predicated on understanding, but there's another key word you mentioned, which is, of course, to pass messages. You have to instantiate that as an agent. You have to actually broadcast. You have to decide what to send and what to listen to. So your use of the word agent, I think, is really important here. So to move towards a universal intelligence that could be unrolled in terms of our transactions on the World Wide Web, I think is to basically understand the physics of agency, and to be an agent under this premise that everything has to be predicated on a generative model means that you have to have generative models of the consequences of your own action. And I think that's really what active inference speaks to, that you have the ability to model what will happen if I do that. And once you've got that in mind, then not only do you have an understanding of the way the cause-effect structure of your world and the way that the content is generated, but you can now select the right moves in accord with the right objective functions, which for me, of course, are the expected free energy and the variational free energies, or more simply, garnering evidence for your generative model of the world, and in so doing, understand how your content was generated. So I think agency is an important aspect of that. And I guess you could sort of induce that from from what's on the tin in active inference. It's about action. And then you ask, well, is not current generative AI agentic? Well, no. I mean, to be agentic, the large language model would have to start prompting you. It would, it would have to have the kind of actions and the imperatives that underwrite those actions that you and I possess, which is effectively information seeking, it's curiosity. I mean, why do we use the web? We don't use the web to feed ourselves or to look after our children. We just use it to resolve uncertainty and get information. So it's a great tool, but if you really want that to work in the spirit of that ecosystems of intelligence thesis that you mentioned earlier, then the users on the web, each node of the web, really has to be seeking information about what? Well, about everything else that's on the web. So we're just trying to build models of each other, or artificial and natural intelligences that are actually exchanging.
So like a reciprocation of curiosity from both parties, or all parties.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I have another question for you, and feel free to answer whatever part of it that you feel comfortable with. 2 years ago in Davos, you and Yann LeCun were on the stage together. I'm sure you saw, I wrote an article kind of summarizing what I saw and witnessed in that conversation. But one thing has kind of stuck with me, and I know it's a question people have asked me. You guys are obviously friends, you are well aware of each other's work, you have a lot of high respect for each other's work. I mean, it was really clear that he has so much respect for your work with active inference. And in that conversation, he was saying, yes, Karl, I agree with you, Karl, with active inference, everything, but we just don't know how to do it any other way. And he was referring to reinforcement learning. Why do you think that somebody who is well aware of everything happening in these ecosystems, or maybe there's something he's missing that he's not aware of, right? But why do you think he has that perspective? And then the larger question in that is, there are a lot of really big tech companies who are, building a lot of tools in AI, but they don't seem to be looking in the direction of active inference very seriously. I know since that conversation in the last 2 years, there's been a lot of progress with the research around scaling and things like that. Was it just a scaling issue? Is it because it doesn't fit the centralized business model of a lot of these? Like, what do you think is the issue there?
What are amongst the 5 issues that you brought to the table?
They're all kind of interrelated, right?
Well, no, they certainly are. There certainly are, and different perspectives and the genesis of So let's take Yann and what's the difference between somebody like me and somebody like Yann? I think it's a very simple difference. I am committed to first principles and was trained as a physicist and think as a physicist. Yes. He is a really skillful engineer, and he's more like my father, who's a civil engineer. So engineers, if it works, that's the way to do it. From my point of view, no, you need to identify the first principles. But I would say that despite the fact that Yann uses the same words in a completely different way than I do. So for him, he says, don't use generative models. Well, what he means is don't use generative AI.
Right.
Whereas, as opposed to the kind of generative models that Geoffrey Hinton introduced in the context of things like the Helmholtz machine and all that wonderful work, you could, I think, trace through to current technology via things like variational autoencoders. So I think there's a much greater convergence between Yann LeCun and myself, and certainly everybody in the active inference fields, than might appear so on the surface. Certainly his work with his more recent work, trying to move the field to a more sort of biomimetic kind of approach. Technically, there is one thing that the engineer in him denies him. So you ask, what is he missing? He's not missing anything. It's just that he's self-denying, self-sabotaging, I would say, in a particular way. And that's it. He does not think it is, in an engineering sense, easy or possible to include uncertainty into his neural networks. So the way that translates is he would say to me, Karl, I think you're absolutely right. We just need to do computation, we need to do sense-making, decision-making under the right kind of generative models, in my sense of the word, using a free energy functional, exactly in the same way that active inference appeals to variational free energy. But he says, well, why don't we just put the temperature to 0? Now, what that means technically is you remove uncertainty from the objective function. So now he can work with really simple reinforcement learning like neural networks that don't have uncertainty. They don't have a calculus or the capacity to deal with belief structures, where a belief is read as a probability distribution. To have a probability distribution, a belief, you have to equip it with precision or uncertainty, and that has to be instantiated at from an engineering perspective. He doesn't do that. So he does everything exactly like I would like it done, but he takes a sort of engineering shortcut and just ignores the uncertainty. But that you pay a very heavy price for that.
And what is that price?
That price is you're not now able to deal with uncertainty in a principled way. One really important consequence of not dealing or encoding uncertainty, sometimes known in engineering as uncertainty quantification, is you can't evaluate the quality of your models, because in order to evaluate the quality of your models, you have to average over your uncertainty. So literally, the model evidence is something that can only be evaluated if you know if you know your uncertainty. So you have to be able to quantify that and evaluate it. But more importantly, if you don't know what you don't know in terms of evaluating your uncertainty, you don't know what questions to ask.
Yeah.
So you can never be a large language model that prompts, that asks questions. So again, we come back to this, what is agency? Well, agency is just querying the world in the right way that resolves your uncertainty. But in order to know what the right way is, you have to know what you don't know before asking the right questions. So that, in one sense, that is the heart of active inference. It's that sort of epistemic affordance or imperative, that information seeking aspect that makes active inference, if you like, much more like you and me, much more like natural intelligence.
Right, and that's where the minimizing complexity comes in, right? Whereas with, deep learning and these LLMs, it's all the information that it has to go through, whether it means anything or not to the prompt at hand, but it still has to waste all of this energy, right?
Absolutely.
Whereas if you have an agent that understands what it doesn't know and it can seek exactly what it needs to know, rather than shifting through a bunch of needless information, time, energy, all of that.
Yeah, we've missed the other 4 points you wanted to talk about, but I think that's such an important point. I think we should just unpack that a bit. Yeah, so absolutely. So, technically, your objective function, if you use a full free energy, which is just basically an expected energy, which is what people in reinforcement learning might use, and it's got the entropy term, which is the uncertainty part. So usually you multiply the entropy by temperature, which is why Yann gets rid of it by setting temperature to 0. Right. But if you're trying to minimize your free energy, you're trying to maximize your entropy. That may sound strange, but it's not, because it keeps your options open. Yeah. It's exactly Occam's principle. And if you now if you just mathematically express complexity, then the complexity is effectively the difference between your posterior and your prior, which is basically the negative entropy that we're talking about, but now thinking about the sort of uncertainty associated, or your priors. So there's a deep connection between this epistemic affordance, this information seeking aspect of true intelligence or universal intelligence, Occam's principle, and complexity minimization, and furthermore, if you're talking to people like Jochen Schmidhuber, complexity minimization. And if you go in the other direction, it's exactly the same as James's maximum entropy principle. All these are mathematically the same, but to just focus on what you focus on, which was the complexity, I think that's a really key thing. So because the machine learning as it currently stands, of the kind that does large, say transformer architectures, cannot encode uncertainty, it can't measure its complexity. So what does that mean? It basically means they've got to find all sorts of engineering widgets and gadgets and heuristics to elude the problems of overfitting and not complying with the right complexity constraints, because it cannot be measured. So you get sort of mini batching, you get dropout, you get all the little things that engineers have found that have worked over the past decades, if not centuries. They're all sort of little devices that are just symptoms of the fact that they're using the wrong objective function, because they're overfitting, exactly because they're not paying attention to the complexity term, which is one way of sort of carving up the free energy or the evidence.
Interesting. So I've had a question in the back of my mind, and we may or may not use this because this is purely a personal question that I have, but if it makes sense, we can include it. This is literally something that I have wondered, because I understand that active inference is looked at, and the free energy principle is looked at as the physics of intelligence, for how it works. And when I look at the free energy, how, and active inference, and you have this action, perception, feedback loop in it, the whole objective is to close that gap on uncertainty, right? But to me, when I look at physics and what I understand of physics, superposition lies within uncertainty, right? And we kind of want to leave that open because that's where possibility lies, right? So how do you, how should I resolve that in my mind? If the way we learn is this constant, loop of trying to get to certainty and close that gap, yet possibility is in there, and we kind of want to play in that space. So where's the balance?
Well, I think you can read this in many ways. You could read it in terms of the balance between exploration and exploitation. You could read it in terms of the balance between accuracy and complexity. You could even read it in terms of what we were just talking about, which is the balance between the energy and the entropy. So any one of those, I think, would make you happy. But let's go back to free energy. Carved or split, decomposed into energy and entropy. You want to minimize your free energy, therefore you want to maximize your entropy. This just is James's maximum entropy principle. It just is finding those solutions, those explanations for your lived world or your content that have the greatest uncertainty, that have the greatest span within which you can play around. So just to put that sort of in narrative form, you want to avoid committing to an overly precise explanation. You want to have that latitude in your head, which of course brings us back to Occam's razor or Einstein's, keep everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. So there is a Goldilocks regime that plays exactly to your notion of, how do you get that balance right? Yeah. The other way, I think, which sort of goes aside, mathematically, is a special case of this balance. Would be when you apply it to what we do. I mean, at the moment, I've just been talking about finding the right explanation for some content. as a scientist who's trying to comply with Occam's principle or the maximum entropy principle, or the free energy principle, when it comes to what am I going to do next, I think that's quite interesting in terms of doing stuff that is exploratory, that renders now surprise alluring. So renders the opportunity to resolve uncertainty means that if something is surprising, there's an opportunity to act in a way to find out what caused that.
Yeah.
What would happen if I did that? So that, I think, makes us into sort of curious creatures, simply because we're trying to minimize uncertainty in the long term, but now we find cues that enable us to, or portend an opportunity to resolve uncertainty, very alluring. You could describe it in terms
so
of
it's almost like
epistemic
this
affordance.
expansion of opening up what are the options before you close and,
Absolutely.
have the observation.
Yeah. And if you take that notion not just to sort of beliefs about hypotheses or explanations for the data from the current state of affairs that you're trying to infer, but also to the very structures and ideas and constructs that you bring to the table, you're now in the world of structure learning. And how do you grow your models? How do you reconfigure your generative models in a way that's apt for this situation, or indeed can explain this novel situation that you've never encountered before? I mean, that I think is a hallmark of, certainly, well, it is active inference, but it's sort of in the domain of the very structures that that we bring to the table to make sense of things. And I mean, you may ask, well, how does machine learning in its current guise cope with that? It just starts off with something that's too big, overly expressive, overly parameterized, and shrinks it. What you're talking about is how do we organically and in the right way grow our little models, to accommodate and explain things that we've never seen before. So there's this sort of top-down approach that we see in current ML, which is vastly inefficient, of course, because you're completely over-parameterized, versus you as an infant, a neonate, growing your little models, growing your brain through epistemic foraging. So that will be a natural way to get to the right level of complexity in the models.
So almost like optimizing the learning opportunity in every moment, right?
Yes.
Interesting. So the other question that I have for you then is the work that you're doing with Verses. What is the most exciting thing about the work that you're currently doing in the research and with what you see evolving with their Genius platform and, where you see that heading? What excites you about that?
Right. I get excited by different things every week. So my general rule of thumb.
I do too.
So, effectively, what is exciting? It changes week by week. So I'll just answer that in a very sort of simple-minded way. What is currently exercising me and my colleagues at Verses in one part of the of the endeavours. I can think of many other exciting things, but one particular one is actually closely related to what we were just talking about, which is this: how do you optimize the learnability, and how do we respond and act in a way that will resolve uncertainty about the very structures that we bring to solve problems? So I think this is nicely exemplified not just by the current preoccupations of Verses in terms of aspirations of equipping the web or the community or our lighthouse customers with the most intelligent solutions, but also something which I see emerging in the machine learning community, which is this notion that we need to move to the next stage, sometimes cast in terms of moving away from Kahneman's System 1 to System 2. So we're talking about understanding as revealed by the ability to reason.
Yeah.
And in my world, reasoning basically is a quintessentially agentic thing. To reason is a verb. So it involves some kind of action. And I think it's exactly the kind of action that we were just talking about. It's basically acting in a way very much like a scientist would, to design experiments that disclose evidence or data from the world that allows you to disambiguate between all sorts of different hypotheses that you might have, the structures, the explanations about which you're reasoning. So if you're a scientist, you keep your world quite simple. You'd have your favorite hypothesis, your alternate hypothesis, and your null hypothesis, and then you design an experiment that gives you exactly the right kind of data that will disambiguate between the two. But I think we do that all the time, online, all the time, throughout our life. We do it a lot more when we're young, but we still do it, so people like you do it in terms of your epistemic foraging. We are constantly building hypotheses and models and then getting the right kind of data that enables us to say, no, it's that hypothesis or that set of hypotheses and not that. And then continue refining and growing and refining and growing and refining. So that's what's exercising me this week. How do you do that automatically? I think it can be done. It's just an extension of active inference, not to the problem of inferring states of affairs in the moment. And it's even beyond what David McKay would call active learning, which is basically getting the right data that will enable you to infer the parameters of a given model with a certain structure. We're now going even beyond that. Now we're asking getting the right data that enables you to disambiguate the structures in and of themselves. So that's a really fascinating problem, which we're currently, I should say, another, I think, another pointer to this sort of, people's, I think we're getting bored with large language models as we see them, and people keep going about the hype cycle and the bubble, which may or may not be, it's slightly beyond my comfort zone. But certainly I see an enthusiasm for what's next.
Yeah.
And I think what's next is exactly this. It's this truly grounded ability to reason, what brought that to the fore for me was the focus of the NeuroAI workshop at NeurIPS last year, but also I then attended System 2 session, and so Francois Chollet introduced ARC3. So I think that style of thinking, that move, I think is symptomatic of the fact people are hungry for the next big thing.
Well, yeah, and I think that people are starting to realize the potential power with having these intelligent agents that we can, kind of evolve with in whatever way that looks, right? But we need to be able to trust them. We need to be able to have them explainable. And, and the thing that I like about active inference is you're not just talking about, building these systems that can cooperate or collaborate with you, but these are co-regulating. And I think it has to do with that symbiosis you're talking about how it even relates to us.
Yeah.
There's a give and take. There's a full circle of a relationship happening there. So to me, that's really exciting because I see that's the potential. And I think that leads me to my last question for you. I'm really curious because you probably have a much further lens on all of this than any of us do. So if you're looking 10 years, 20 years down the road, what do you envision life is going to be like for people, given that all of this technology keeps going down the trajectory that you see it on its path? What do you think it's going to be like for humans to live 10, 20 years from now?
It's not going to be a very clever answer. I think you'll be surprised how similar it is to live now, but without all the angst that we currently experience. I often, so for example, I can remember watching 2001: Space Odyssey and thinking, "Wow, I hope I'm alive to see 2001."
Right.
And then you look at 2001, then you look at 2021, and actually, in many respects, nothing has really changed. All the good bits of life, nothing has really changed that much. with the exception of sort of iPhones. But we had telephones, when I was growing up. So I don't think much is actually going to change very much. And of course, from the point of view of the free energy principle, the whole point is you've got this pullback attractor. The whole point is it's a physics of sustainability. If we are here and we are here in a characteristic way, then mathematically speaking, then we are part of this attracting set. And that sort of unpacks in a sort of scale-free fashion, which means that we should celebrate retaining the things that characterize us. So I think, to answer your question, in 10 years, we're doing exactly what we're doing now, but hopefully there will be less worries and uncertainty.
We'll solve some big problems maybe with this.
Well, for me, of course, problems just are uncertainty. And so, of the kind that are induced by geopolitical conflicts,
yes.
Of the kind that are induced by personal life trajectories, of the kind that are induced by, am I a member of this group or that group? Does that person like me? What will happen if I did that? All the problems that we contend with are just resolving uncertainty. So I think if the free energy principle is going to be realized, or we conform to the free energy principle, what that means is that all the tech that is developed will be in the service of jointly minimizing our uncertainty and our free energy, which just basically means there will be a better joint mutual understanding. You mentioned this in terms of the symbiosis or reciprocity, generalized synchronization. These are the dynamical hallmarks of self-organization to this attracting set that characterizes us as a particular species. So that the end point of this is basically communication, because via communication we resolve uncertainty about ourselves. That's not to say we're all going to be homogenous. There will be in-groups and out-groups, and there will still be an epistemic affordance of being curious about what this out-group says, or this community, or this theology, or this alternative, that's not part of my in-group, but there will be that will be, if you like, in the context of a much more synchronized, harmonious exchange and information exchange within well-formed groups.
One of the things that really stood out to me in that white paper from back in 22 was when you were describing what's necessary for this evolving intelligence is that it depends on the diversity of all the intelligences. And so to me, when I look at the potential with active inference and then what the spatial web enables with this distribution of these agents that kind of become this organism of intelligence within networks, it preserves what you're talking about, all the different diversity, different belief systems, different governing styles, all of that. To me, that alone tells me this is the direction that it has to go in, because we'll never, ever agree on anything globally. There's too many, regional differences, too many.
Which should be celebrated. I mean, just to sort of really reinforce that point. If you look at this through the lens of theoretical biology and evolutionary thinking, the codependence we have on all sorts of things, from atoms of molecules of oxygen through to bees, through to trees. We only are here because of that diversity. We could not exist without everything in that ecosystem, and that has enormous diversity over many, many different scales. And the same applies to sort of human and indeed political culture. But to have that diversity, to have those different kinds of things, they have to be demarcated, so they have to be able to preserve the Markov blankets. So you are talking about a physics that enables the preservation and the segregation that identifies or individuates, demarcates this kind of thing that enables the diversity to be self-maintaining. So I think it's a really crucial thing. Of course, you could start to argue now, what would that look like at a geopolitical level? Well, Markov blankets, can sometimes be literally thought about as borders.
Right.
And that's what I had in mind when I was talking about problems and our uncertainty. And at a geopolitical level, it's uncertainty about borders, as we are seeing in Gaza, as we're seeing in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. So one would hope that all these Markov blankets will be in a much more certain configuration that do celebrate the diversity, simply because we've now demarcated this kind of thing and that kind of thing, this kind of culture, this, in a stable but synchronized and mutually respectful way. And that will be the free energy minimizing solution. That will be facilitated with the right kind of communication.
Right. I see that. That makes a whole lot of sense. Karl, thank you so much for taking this time with me today. It has been such a deep pleasure to be able to have a conversation with you like this. And thank you for humoring me with my own questions that were just personal to me. And if you were to leave our audience with any parting words, what would they be?
Keep your options open. That's how I was.
I love that. That's solid advice. Karl, thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to meet you in person. I love your work. I love to hear your opinions because I feel like you are one of the truth speakers about the current state of AI. I would love for you to share with our audience kind of who you are, why you do what you do.
So I'm Gary Marcus. I'm a cognitive scientist by training, but with a lifelong interest in AI. I study, I would say, both natural and artificial intelligence, and I speak truth to bullshit. And I actually said on 60 Minutes that what large language models produce is authoritative bullshit. And that was always true of the models. It's become increasingly true of the industry, that there's a lot of authoritative, meaning it sounds like it's true, but it's actually bullshit. And I'm just allergic to that as a scientist, right? First and foremost, I am a scientist, a cognitive scientist in particular, and I'm interested in what the truth is, what the arguments are, how did we get there, are we in the right place? And I don't think we're in the right place now. I often get called an AI hater. That's not me at all. I started working on AI when I was 10 years old. I'm very interested in AI. I want it to work. I want it to be good for society. I just don't think that what we're doing with large language models and stealing copyright and having these unreliable systems and giving them lots of authority is the right thing to do. That doesn't mean I hate AI. It means I hate the way we're doing it now. Sometimes I feel like a parent with a recalcitrant teenager. I actually have two great kids. This is not my personal experience. But imagine that you have a teenager who's kind of like fucking up, but you still love them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's how I see AI right now. It's fucking up. I still love it. It's not doing the right thing.
You want the best for it.
I want the best. It needs some advice right now.
Wow. Yeah. No, I hear that. And I think there's a lot of people who really do recognize that. So then what do you think is the solution? What do we need in AI? What would be the right path for AI?
I mean, there are moral, political, and technical solutions, because there's actually problems all over the map. So, on the governance side, we do actually need governance here.
Yes.
Every technology needs governance. Somehow there's this insane idea that AI doesn't. But we all know AI could actually kill a lot of people. Like, it's crazy to have no governance of it. We could argue, this regulation is, too burdensome, and this one's just right, or whatever. Like, we can have an intelligent argument, but to say that we don't need any governance at all is absurd. So we need governance. Most important thing there is we need kind of pre-flight check. If you're going to release something to 100 million people, you should figure out if it's safe. Like, what are the consequences, and not just like roll it out. Like, certain large companies I could name are about to do with, say, porn products. Like, how's that going to affect society? Like, do we have any data at all about this?
Yeah.
So that's one side of it. On the technical side, LLMs, I don't think they're ever going to be reliable. I warned about their predecessors hallucinating in 2001. It's 25 years later. The core problem that leads to that, a kind of overgeneralization when you don't have good records of individuals versus kinds, hasn't changed since I wrote the book, The Algebraic Mind. And people just keep hoping, like magic, like some kind of religion here. And it's not actually getting better. I think to do better, what we need are systems where the core is actually a model of the world that you can explicitly interrogate. You know, what are the things there? So we're sitting in a room. There are chairs. There are exit signs. There's a phone with a kind of lighting source on it, etc. There's two people. You're nodding your head. You're paying attention to me. You seem to like what I'm saying. Doesn't look like we're out of time or that I've lost you. And so I'm building all of this, and you know, I can probably get a laugh out of you. Right? So I'm building this model in my head of where we are and so forth. I have different models for other things. I just watched, you know, the Harry Potter movies with my kids, and like there's magic. It doesn't apply here. I'm not expecting any wizards to walk in here, but in the context of that movie, if a wizard didn't show up, I'd be like, what's going on here, right? So we have different models of different parts of the world, including fictional worlds. That is core to our understanding of how the world works. And LLMs don't have that. So we need approaches where that's core. And then second to that, you might know Kahneman's System 1 and System 2, fast and automatic versus slow and deliberative. That's roughly neural networks versus classic symbolic AI. We need both. And there's been so much tension in the field. People trying to say, my flavor is the only flavor.
Right.
My flavor is the only. We actually need some of both, and we need some new ideas to integrate those. So that, for example, if you have a world model, you can consult it. Like LLMs will make up stuff like, you know, where somebody's born, even when it's amply documented in the internet. They don't have a good connection between world knowledge and the way that they're doing the processing. So we need to solve that as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. So when you look at the future, because one of the big issues with these LLMs too is, you know, they are still useful tools, but it's not a sustainable path for AI when you look at the energy requirement and you look at, to me, there's just so much
teenagers only need 20 watts, right? Like, imagine a teenager but with a gigawatt or 50 gigawatt. I mean, quite right about that.
What do you think is going to happen with that? Because to me, what I see happening here is you've got all of these companies that are holding really tight to this centralized business model and this whole, you know, giant databases, giant data centers to run these AIs instead of this distributed AI scenario where you can have agents distributed through networks, through operating at the edge. That is an energy efficient way, especially when you consider Karl's free energy principle and the way that works. Do you see this being a transition? You're about to get on stage with Karl and have a conversation. Where do you see us going?
On the central versus distributed, I think it remains to be seen. I think there's a lot of factors there. So one factor is like, what is the computation you're doing? And to make an LLM work, you need these massive databases to train them on. You don't need that for a human child. They can learn on a much smaller fraction of the internet. So there's that side of it. There's a kind of
babies aren't pre-trained; they're born.
Well, babies are pre-trained in a certain weird sense of that word by evolution. And part of the problem with these neural networks is they don't really have evolved minds. They just do everything from actual training. Whereas we have evolved minds that allow us to, for example, understand the world in terms of sets of objects and so forth. One of the things I do like about Versus is they're trying to get what I would call innate priors, and that connects to some of what Karl's thinking about, in their systems, rather than just learning everything from data. So innate priors, for example, about objects traveling on spatially connected paths. That's something that we need. I mean, more broadly, Karl is a fantastic scientist. We've spoken before, and I'm looking forward to going out and talking with him again.
Yeah, well, I am so glad that you're here, and thank you so much for giving us a few minutes of your time today. And Gary, it's just such a pleasure to meet you.
Thanks a lot.
Super exciting. We're honored to have those two people, those two giants in the field sitting next to me. So on the one hand, we have Gary Marcus. He's a cognitive scientist and author, Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Neuroscience at NYU, entrepreneur, and a leading public voice on AI and AI policy. And then we have Karl Friston, the professor at UCL, chief scientist at Versus. And if you don't know who he is, you are in the wrong room. So let's get started. So we're intended to talk about the future of AI. But let's get started by reflect a bit on the current state of AI. And when people outside of this room think about AI, they typically think about generative AI or LLMs. And rumor has it, Gary, that you're not that fond of LLMs. So can you maybe quickly give a summary of what your critiques are on the current state of LLMs and where they're going?
Sure, but first I'll mention that yesterday Noah Smith, who goes by Noah Opinion on Twitter, had a tweet about how AI haters were medieval peasants. And I couldn't tell whether that was supposed to refer to me, because a lot of people describe me as an AI hater, but you got the scope right. I don't hate AI, I actually love AI. I would spend all of my time reading and writing, and I built a company which I sold to Uber. So I wouldn't spend all this time on AI if I hated it, but I do hate LLMs. I'll be honest about that. They have their uses. Another straw man of me yesterday was to imply that people of my kind, anyway, think that LLMs are useless, and I've never said that. I think that they do have some uses. I just think that the negatives are probably outweighing the positives, and there's multiple kinds of negatives. So the positives are, for example, they help sophisticated coders do some of the drudge work of coding. They may help poor coders make really insecure code, we could talk about that. But they certainly help coders, they help with brainstorming, they help with translation, they help non-native speakers write. So they do have some value, but I think that they're the wrong way to approach AI. I think you need world models at the core of how you build AI, or else you hallucinate. And I've been warning about that since 2001, before there were LLMs. In my book, Algebraic Mind, I said if you use these kinds of neural networks, and the LLMs are descendants of the kinds that I was talking about then, you're going to have problems of overgeneralization. You're not going to get facts right. And that's been a problem for a quarter century. So there are reliability problems. There's also a weird kind of cultural problem, which is we have an intellectual monoculture right now, where everybody is basically doing the same thing at really enormous scale. There's this old line about the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, may I present to you the field of AI right now, where people keep building larger and larger LLMs, hoping it'll magically solve the hallucination problem and the what I call the boneheaded reasoning or boneheaded error problem. We still get that. Like, none of this has really changed. Maybe it's reduced a little, but clearly these are not fundamentally safe architectures. And then you have the kind of moral and political problem. So how do you make LLMs work? Well, first thing you do apparently is you steal all of the data from every artist and writer ever, and then you try to persuade the government that that's okay, the copyright laws don't apply to you. I don't think that's okay. And it's led to, I think, some very poor choices on the part of a lot of people running the AI companies. And clearly what they want to do is take your job and make you watch slop and porn all day. Like, I mean, that's almost not even a joke. That's like, Altman 2 weeks ago was like, we have really hard choices because we have a shortage of chips. Of course, he needs a lot of chips because his technology is not very efficient, but putting that aside, he says, you know, we have a shortage of chips, and so we have to make hard decisions like solving cancer in the next year or two, or fixing education. The reality is that LLMs are not going to solve cancer in the next year or two. Even if they were like these super genius things that they pretend they are, you'd still need to do the clinical work, and it just tells you that Sam has no clue about clinical work if he thinks it's remotely possible to solve cancer in a year or two. So, I mean, it's all bullshit. Can I say that here? But aside from the fact that it's all bullshit, that was late September. Here we are in mid-October. What is he actually doing with his chips? He's revealed that he's going to, inside a mental health announcement, he reveals in the last paragraph that they're going to start asking for ID because they're going to have, quote, erotica, which I think rather dignifies the garbage that's going to come out. And he said that he's going to make a competitor to TikTok that's going to be all AI slop generated by Sora, unlicensed, all the time. So, like, there's the political side that also makes me hate not AI, but LLMs used in this way. Like, there are got to be better things. I had an op-ed, and then I'll run into the microphone because I'm obviously going on for a long time. I had an op-ed yesterday in the New York Times, and the way I ended it is by saying maybe we need to focus on more special purpose models that don't make all of these mistakes, that do particular things in medicine, education, and so forth. I didn't say it rather than making porn and slop, but I think it was implied. And so, like, I think we can do great things with AI, but maybe not in the way that LLMs are doing.
Yeah, I think this gives us lots of food for thought for the next 30 minutes. Karl, on your end, a year ago, you said, I quote, "Deep learning is rubbish." Do you still stand with that quote?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Let's just contextualize that. I had to say something entertaining and controversial, very much in the spirit that Marcus has been invited here Karen's been invited here to entertain us. So you should say the things, because people love to hear that, but none of us dare actually say them, so it's great that you're actually...
Can I interrupt just briefly? What's really interesting to me is how much the world has changed in the last 3 months. I got so much, as long as I'm being found out, so much shit in the last 7 years as, quote, AI hater, and people question my intellectual integrity. It's really kind of hard being me for the last 7 years. And then people noticed when GPT-5 was not what it was supposed to be. So one of the things I kept saying is that GPT-5 is going to be late, and it's not going to be AGI, it's not going to be magic. And it wasn't, and people really noticed. And I have been treated so much better in the last couple of months. Now people want to hear me diss LLM. So it's a fun moment.
Your time has come. Anyway, why did I say that LLMs or deep learning was rubbish? I think you could play that angle, or sort of justify that perspective from a number of different angles. You mentioned efficiency, would be certainly one angle. What I was specifically getting at in the conversation with Yann LeCun at that point was the failure of large language models to encode uncertainty, basically. In his language, not that came out in the conversation, but in his language, he would certainly be perfectly okay with formulating AI as a free energy minimizing process, but the free energy would have to be equipped with a zero temperature. And what that basically does is it nullifies the entropy. So you're basically talking about a tech that has no capacity to encode uncertainty. And what does that mean? Well, it means you can't encode what you don't know. So you have to look everywhere. You have to ingest and steal all the data, because you've got no way of knowing how to be curious. So we're just seeing with Gentana's beautiful presentation, the fundamental importance of being curious, resolving your uncertainty to get to that kind of sample efficiency, which precludes or obviates the need to then go and steal everybody's data in a really inefficient way. And I can't remember how the conversation developed, but certainly from the point of view of sustainability, I think that's a really important argument, but you could play that in many, many different ways. One thing which, having introduced Yann LeCun, because you've had lots of lovely arguments with him, and I sometimes see him and you on the same side, because you're both rebels without a cause in some respects. But there's one thing which I don't understand, it's the use of the word world models and generative models. Now, I've always understood generative models in the spirit of Geoffrey Hinton and the Helmholtz machine as a sort of probabilistic specification of the cause-effect structure of content. And yet, Yann seems to say you shouldn't be using generative models. And I notice you carefully use the word world models. So I'd be interested to hear what do people mean by generative AI, and what is the implication for generative models in the context of generative AI?
Those are two really different questions. So before I get to either of those questions, I'll just say I think you're exactly right about uncertainty and these systems not representing that. And that's a very serious problem. So all the hallucinations, for example, they fail to give you a confidence around it. I wrote a whole essay about my friend Harry Shearer, who's, all of you know his voice because he does voices for some of the characters in The Simpsons, probably all of you have seen him. And he was a bass player in Spinal Tap, so he's a pretty well-known actor. And it's very easy to figure out where he was born. In fact, you can just go to Wikipedia, or you can go to IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes or anything like that. And somebody sent him a biography, which he gleefully sent to me, where it said that he was a British actor, comedian, etc. So the system hallucinated where he's from, even though it's trivially easy to find on the internet. A proper system, the very least it should do, is to weigh the evidence and say, I see thousands of things on the internet saying he was born in Los Angeles, and yet here I am compelled, because I have a language model that sticks things in embedded spaces and loses track of them, to say that he's British. It must, you should have some probability assigned to that, some confidence interval. It's one of a zillion examples of these systems. That's why I say it's authoritative bullshit. The authoritative part is it presents everything with 100% confidence, even when it should not, with 100% certainty when it should not. Okay, so if I completely agree on your first point that is central. This audience fully understands that. I don't always use that terminology in the lay audience, but your point about uncertainty is 100% right. Second, LeCun, we are famous for having arguments, but the arguments all happened in 2019. In 2018, when I said that deep learning, I didn't say it was rubbish, but I said that it had problems, and he said that I was mostly wrong, and he never spelled it out. And then in 2019, I said LLMs didn't work, and he said I was fighting a rearguard battle. So what people don't remember, they all remember that we had a fight, but they don't remember what the positions were. And his position was that LLMs were hunky-dory and that this was great progress. This is in fact his position up until November of 2022, when he released a model called Galactica, which he thought was fantastic, and he bragged on it. He said, look how great it is. And a bunch of us, including me, but not limited to me, showed that it had problems too. Like there was a journalist who showed that it would happily write essays like, what are the benefits of eating crushed glass? Or extol anti-Semitism and so forth. And so Facebook, not me, but really Yann, decided to remove it. And Yann's very bitter about that. Then what happened is it's true, and it's amply documented. And then what happened is 2 weeks later, ChatGPT came out. It was actually a very similar model. And he was bitter, and I sort of understand, because that model became really popular, and his, which was technically really not that different. It didn't have the guardrails that it should have. He felt very bitter about it, and that's when he turned against LLMs. So ever since then, he sounds just like me, except that he won't cite anything by Marcus, and I often do. But that's the only difference between us now. So, I mean, this is another way of saying I won the argument, but nobody remembers what the argument was. They just remember that people were upset. If you go back and look at the actual arguments, there's nothing that he said then that he still believes. And everything that I said then, he now does with it. So it's a little bit strange. Okay, so now world models. There are actually some genuine differences between his view and my view, although we never really argue about it because we don't really talk anymore because he won't cite me, but anyway. So world model for me is partly a symbolic representation. I can conceive that there might be a way of doing it without things like databases and ontologies and so forth, but I've never seen anything remotely successful doing that. All the AI, it's probably too strong, most of the AI that I know actually does have explicit world models. I'll give you an example, the navigation system that got me here today. I kind of know Montreal a little, I didn't know exactly from the hotel or whatever, so I just followed the GPS system. Well, the GPS system has a world model, literally. It has a model of what the streets are, what the connections are, how long it takes to go. So I chose to walk. He told me 10 minutes, which was about accurate, except I walked faster. But it was close enough. And so it does its computation by a simple classical AI algorithm of finding shortest path given a list of routes. Similarly, Wikipedia gives you a world model that tells you a bunch of things about Harry Shearer, like what are the movies that he's been in. The thing also hallucinated that he was in Jaws, and he had nothing to do with Jaws. Although there it turns out that there was one web page that got it wrong, and the system doesn't know, that again, lacking certainty, it doesn't know that like one place reported this and it's not verified. It can't actually reason through those kinds of things. So there is the Wikipedia stuff. I mean, this is even in the boxes, right? The boxes in Wikipedia are the easy stuff that we actually do know how to deal with. Structured text. All of that gives you a world model. Where was he born? When was he born? Etc. You just look it up. any, credible AI should at least be able to use that stuff. So for me, a world model is that. And I think we have lots of world models. For example, my kids just watched the Harry Potter movies. I watched a little bit with them. And so you have a fictional world model where there are wizards and things happen with those wizards. And like, you understand that that's not going to happen here. Nobody's going to ride in here on a broomstick. But it would be weird to watch a whole Harry Potter movie with nobody flying on a broomstick. So we have multiple world models, in fact, and they can be incomplete. Like, I have a model of this room. I'd say there's 100, 200 people in here or something like that, but I can't tell you the exact number. I can get some sense of, like, distribution, demographics, age, and stuff like that. I can't give you all the details, and that's fine. You don't need to have all the details. I know enough for present purposes. If I need to know more, I can zero in on this table and try to figure out, okay, there's this many people there, and so you can make them detailed. So world models don't have to be infinitely detailed, but they need to be structured, and I don't even know how to say this word, interrogable. You need to be able to ask them questions and reliably get answers out of them. You should have a world model, and I should be like, who's this guy sitting next to me? And I should be able to, figure out something about it and remember something. Remember some of the places we've met before and some of the places we've spoken. It might not be perfect. We might have met enough times that I don't remember all of them, but I remember, sitting in your office, whatever it was, 6 months ago, and I remember we did an event in Davos 2 years ago, and so, like, I have a lot of detail there, not infinite detail. I don't remember every sentence that we said, but I use that centrally for almost everything that I do. Now, there's a different sense of world model, which I've seen DeepMind use, and which I suspect that Yann might use, which is something like, and I think you alluded to, it is something like a function that predicts things. And that's also a kind of world model, but I think it's not what I'm looking for, not all of what I'm looking for. So there is a sense in which a world model is, a function that predicts things, but I'm also looking for something that has the structure and the facts, and it should probably have probabilities attached to it, right? The classic symbolic AI version of it was basically not quantitative and not probabilistic, and I think, a fair discovery of the last 30 years is you really want that probabilistic information. I mean, in fact, the thing that LLMs do well is they have some probabilistic distributional information, but they don't have the uncertainty represented at all. You actually want all of this. So, getting to the right AI is going to require doing some hard work around it. And I'll say one more thing, which is people might have seen, I think it's called CTS, blanking on the name. There's this new model just came out a day or two. It's a biological model predicting things about cells and so forth. CTS scale, I think is the last word. This is a system that actually has many different carefully engineered bits of knowledge that are structured. Like, there's this imagination, you can just throw everything into a black box. But that's the most successful black box-ish model that I've seen, and it still, like, has specific representations for how it represents cells, and there's this incredibly intricate curriculum for how you train it, what pieces of knowledge, and so forth. The right answer to AI is really going to be different in different domains. It's going to have a lot of structure, and some of that's probably going to be a world model.
So if I understand you well, your notion of a world model is more or mainly about structuring the knowledge and being able to interrogate the structure. But what I'm missing from your interpretation is the concept of action. Like, how can you have a structure? How can you build a structure of this room if you're not able to walk through this room and experience walking through the room and meet the people in order to have, like, the concept of how many people are there? Like, don't you need the action fundamentally there to build the model?
So there's two pieces to that. The first I will call a friendly amendment to what I'm saying. The second I'm not sure I agree with. So world models also have, I didn't go into all of this. World models also have to have a notion of causality, of action, events, and so forth. So you're quite right that I should have stressed that. The second part is, do you actually need to be embodied to have world models? I don't think so, or at least not as much as people think, but it's probably helpful. So I look to psychology to understand that. It's a guide, it might not be a perfect guide, but what I notice is that there are people in the world who are paralyzed, for example, and there are people with things like SMA, who basically never moved around the world and still build pretty good models of the world in the sense that you can talk to them about it, they seem to understand things even that they can't physically do, and so forth. So my view about embodiment is it's awfully helpful if you look at developmental psychology literature. So once kids crawl around, they very quickly learn a lot of things about the world, but it may not be strictly necessary. And when we get to AI, like, it's kind of an open question. There was a critique by Emily Bender that I thought was too strong of LLMs that said that because they only have language, they can't really learn that much, they don't really have much understanding. I think the right view is if you only have language, you're limited, but you could probably actually do a lot. Or you can think about Helen Keller. She had a little bit of experience before she went blind and deaf at 18 months. She had a little bit of physical experience, and she's continued a haptic experience. But she constructed very intricate models of the world and was able to write and be successful and influential and so forth. So I don't know how much and what kinds of experience are absolutely necessary. I do think that it's really great if you get that experience. There's a field called developmental robotics, which I think has yielded nothing really important in 30 years of trying, but it might eventually. So the problem is, in my view, so developmental robotics is like you let the robot roam around the world and it's supposed to learn something that it couldn't otherwise learn. And it stands to reason that you could do that. But what I often see are like experiments where somebody puts an apple back and forth in front of the robot and says, apple, apple, apple. And like, it doesn't get much further than that. I think that the problem is prejudice in the field of machine learning. So, you know the old thing about give a man a hammer, he thinks everything is a nail. So in machine learning, they tend to think that you need to learn everything. But I think if you look at biology, lots of stuff is innate. And in fact, the innate stuff is what allows you to learn. And I think the sophisticated people in animal psychology talk about innately guided learning, people like Peter Marler, Randy Gallistel, and so forth. So what you can learn is a function of what's innate. What kind of structures do you have for world models? What do you have observational learning, imitation learning? Can you do more sophisticated things like that allow us to learn calculus or learn about cognitive science? So I think that the problem with developmental robotics is that they always start from a completely blank slate. And I think that there's one thing LLMs have taught us, it's that starting with a completely blank slate only gets you so far. Like LLMs, get all the sense data in the world in a certain sense. You get the entire internet, you get lots of video data, and they still don't understand that objects persist in space and time. So you want to start with that, which is something your company does some work with. You want to start with stuff like that. And then maybe the developmental robotics project might actually be really super interesting. It hasn't worked yet, but I wouldn't count it out for exactly that reason.
So Karl, what's your take on the requirement of action to build your world model?
I think we just stand back and think about, can you be intelligent if you're not an agent? And if you're not an agent, or to be an agent, does that necessarily imply some kind of action? So I mean, I agree entirely that physical embodiment is a really important aspect of being an agent, because you execute your agency through the body. But you all can imagine having agency without necessarily a sort of physically instantiated body. But I think agency is the key thing here, and sort of begs the question: what is it to be an agent? Is a thermostat an agent? And I would argue that, from the point of view of artificial intelligence, agency is to be an agent is to have intentions. And to have intentions is to have a world model of the consequences of your action, which necessarily implies a world model that is future pointing, that is counterfactual, that can deal with things that have not yet happened, that you intend to happen, that gives you a sense of selection. So I think agency is going to be, is a key thing that would draw a bright line between intelligence or artificial intelligence as represented by large language models and the kind of intelligence that we're talking about, Sparta, we're talking about here. And just to, why would large language models not meet that mark? I think it was implicit in one phrase that you were said earlier on, in relation to large language models, implying that it's basically just a mapping between content and content. Another way of putting that, engineers have found some way to utilize universal function approximators to map from content to content. That there's nothing, if you like, in the middle. There's no understanding. Very much in the spirit of sort of a statistician being comfortable with an autoregressive model as a description of sequences of data without understanding how those data were generated and how they might be generated under different interventions or more different actions. So I'm coming back to defending my notion that large language models are rubbish, because there's another way in which they are rubbish, that they don't have agency. So when large language models now demonstrate, evince agency in the sense of being curious about their world, when they start asking questions, then I think large language models will be showing some kind of authentic intelligence, simply because they've now become agents. So I should say in defense, I was looking at John Tarnage. Developmental neurorobotics, yes, there is a lot of rubbish there. I think there's also some wonderful stuff. I have to say some of the deepest questions which you actually spoke to, certainly from a sort of cognitive science and psychological perspective, some of the deepest questions about agency and how we acquire agency, beyond learning, and how that's contextualized by innate things. And I should also slip in here, inference is not learning, so inferring what's going on is, you can learn to infer certainly, but inference is, I think, another level of sense making that we need. Most of those, the deepest questions to me actually come from either developmental psychology or developmental robotics. If you're so committed to an embodied context in the context of robotics. So just to sort of make sure that not all robotics has failed to deliver. I think there are some really interesting developments.
I mean, at the very least, I think the questions, and I should have made this clear, I think the questions in developmental robotics are really interesting. It's just most of the work that I have seen, I think, has a bias towards let's learn it all from scratch. It's probably not true of all of the work, and I'm sorry that I didn't see the talk earlier, which may have been very interesting. But in general, there's been this, I'm going to do things with a blank slate, which is the same thing we see with LLMs, right? They're completely blank slate, and people keep getting the same results. The questions that developmental robotics tries to answer, I think, are really, really interesting. And for that matter, you could say the same about LLMs. The question they're trying to answer is, how do you get a mind from data? It's just that the real answer to that is you also have some stuff built in to have scaffolding around that data, so, in terms of the inference mechanisms, in terms of the learning mechanisms, in terms of some set of priors. And people tend to exclude those for whatever reason. But it's super interesting. And just to close the circle on agency, people do use LLMs as agents. They just don't work that well. There was a system a few years ago that nobody even remembers called AutoGPT. And there was a flurry on Twitter of people saying how it was amazing and how it was going to change the world. And after about a month, people realized it didn't work very well because of the reliability problem. So it would do things like you'd say, I want you to place this stock trade, such and such, and it would say, I'm on it, because that's something that, content to content, you can approximate that people will say, I'm on it when you give them a request. But the system didn't have the passwords to actually place the trade. It didn't have the wherewithal to say, I don't have the passwords. And so, it would say that it had done this thing for you, but it hadn't. So it would feign agency. It couldn't really do agency because it didn't really have the world model, didn't really have the causal understanding, didn't really know what an action was. And so you can make it pretend to be an agent, but it's not a very good one.
But then again, you could say, let's put the structure in there from the get-go, but also that we tried for an awful lot of time with expert systems before the rise of deep learning. Everyone was trying to do that.
So expert systems actually worked better than people remember them to. Their problem was they were brittle. And the problem with LLMs is they're brittle. So in the expert systems day, the really lousy thing about it was you had to pay a lot of like graduate students a bunch of money to fix all of the edge cases that they didn't do well. But they kind of worked. LLMs, they kind of work, but now you pay Kenyan contractors to fix all the errors, or you pay mathematicians or whatever, but they're still brittle. It's like very much a similar reality to before.
Yeah, that's what can have, instead of having two things that kind of work, what's then the road to have something that works?
Well, so, I mean, the question is how to get something to work. So, my view is if you look at classic symbolic AI and neural networks, that they are very complementary. It is obvious that we should be spending all of our effort not gathering bigger databases, but figuring out how we can get the best of both worlds. So, classic symbolic AI is great at representing world models. That's a lot of what the work was on. It is great at generalizing from small amounts of data in narrow contexts. Representing something as a function is an incredibly powerful thing. It allows you to generalize beyond the cases that you've seen before, which is a weakness in the neural networks. But the problem is it's always had to be handcrafted. And of course, the really early stuff didn't represent probability and uncertainty very well at all. Then you have neural networks that are great at learning from massive amounts of data, but everything that they learn is too superficial and it doesn't generalize very well. You wind up with Teslas being summoned across an airplane parking lot and running into an airplane because the knowledge that they have is so superficial. So it seems obvious to me that we should want to bring them together. And it's just a political history. You have people like Jeff Hinton that are bitter because they didn't get funding, and so they dump on the symbolic stuff and tell people don't try to bridge this world. But the exciting reality is in the last few years, people have stopped listening to the Hintons and LeCuns of the world who said, don't do that symbolic stuff, it's bad, it's a waste of time, it's like putting gas engines when you already invented electric. I mean, Hinton really said this. And what's happened the last few years is people have worked on neurosymbolic AI and gotten good results. AlphaFold is a neurosymbolic system that does try to combine a generative system with classic search, for example.
So Karl, what's your take on this? Is combining those two systems together, Frankenstein the system together, is that the way forward, or is something else or more needed?
That's your word, not mine.
That's a good word. So, what did you imply though by that? What did you imply by that?
Well, basically, it's as if you have system A that kind of works and has certain limitations. You have system B that kind of works with different limitations. So the obvious solution then is to bring them together, but I don't think it's so straightforward to just glue these vastly different things together and have the best of both worlds.
How to do it is not obvious.
You might also end up with the brittleness of both.
Yeah, so my answer. I can see from an engineering perspective you might want to try and do that, and of course the dangers that have entailed. But from a physicist's perspective, I think you've been looking for what you want your intelligence to do and what principles should it comply with. Will it leverage or rest upon the technology underlies generative AI as we currently know it? Possibly to a certain extent, but I think that would be an add-on. Of course, we've spent many months, years talking about amortization as one way of sort of using deep neural networks to finesse the problem of evaluating your beliefs about the causes of your content and what you are going to do next, mapping from content to belief structures, probability distributions, encoding that uncertainty. Just to bring in the sort of symbolic aspect, I am reading symbolic here basically as having a particular function form for your world models or your generative models, in which you have a discrete and relatively small number of states of the world that can be associated or equipped with the semantics or the symbolic aspect, so that you've now got a calculus or an aspect of these generative models that enable you to sort of make logical, inductive kinds of comments, if this, then that. And therefore, what we'll be looking at from a first principles perspective is basically how would you use, technically, how would you invert a generative model that generated continuous consequences from discrete symbolized causes. And of course that then speaks to a particular class of generative models. And an interestingly sort of an interesting technical point here is the message passing or the inversion or the realization or the solution that would be required in terms of sense-making, decision-making, and action will be very different under a symbolic architecture. So you'd be using causality, propagation, or variational message passing. You would not be using the kind of continuous dynamics associated with transformer architectures or continuous state-space models. So I think there are implications about how usable sort of current deep RL-like technology would be if you're committing to a purely symbolic kind of architecture.
I love most of that, and I wind up being slightly more sympathetic to LLMs than you, but only slightly so. So I think first of all that I would like to strongly endorse the first principles thinking that you're talking about, and I agree with most of the principles that you laid out. I think that you need to have systems that do the kinds of things that you talked about, and I would agree that LLMs do not do those things. Probably the only difference is I think that LLMs can be subcomponents in systems that do those things. There are certain places where they're good at calculating kind of distributions in a very broad sense, and I think that they can help. I think that you want the sort of master of the system to be a symbolic system for a lot of the reasons that you just laid out. And if you're going to do the inferences properly, then you really need to be able to look at the data, you need to be able to look at the priors, you need to be able to adjust them and so forth. And it just doesn't look like LLMs are good at that. What we have right now actually is a bit Frankenstein, which is in recent months, maybe the last couple of years, people discovered in the industry that scaling was not really working, scaling a pure pre-training. So most of the money was spent on the notion that if we just put in more data, we would kind of, the word was emergence, but I think you can call it magic. The notion was it would magically emerge that these systems would solve all the problems that critics like me have been pointing out for a long time. And what they realized last November, roughly speaking, so about a year ago, was that this was not working. And they had some intimation of that before. There's very interesting data from Grok 4 showing that what's really helping are tools. But what are the tools? The tools, they don't like to tell you this, but they're actually symbolic systems. The tools are things like Python, which is a code interpreter, which is as symbolic as you can get, right? It's full of functions operating over variables. Go back to Marcus 2001, who tries to defend what symbol manipulation even means. It's functions operating over variables. So what they have done is they have stuck those inside of LLMs. And that's actually most of what's helping now. But it is Frankenstein, if I understand the connotation of that word, in the sense that it's kind of like bolted on, which really fits the metaphor. It's kind of bolted on as an afterthought. And it sort of works. It works better than not doing that. Like they actually get some mileage out of it. You look at this graph from Grok 4. I have a paper called How O3 and Grok 4 Accidentally Vindicated Neurosymbolic AI, which you can find on Substack. And it has this graph. And tools are doing most of, explaining most of the lift of the improvements that systems have recently gotten. So there is actually empirical leverage in Frankenstein. But it's Frankenstein in the sense that it's added on as an afterthought rather than doing what Karl is rightly recommending, which is to say, from first principles, what do we want cognition to even look like? We want to have agency. We want to have representations of uncertainty. I would say we want to have what I call free generalization, which I think fits the world in the sphere of things that Karl said. How are we going to do that? Well, we're obviously not going to do that with these opaque black boxes that don't allow us to make those kind of inferences in an informed way, representing uncertainty and so forth. So yes, you get something out of Frankenstein, and no, that's not what we really want here. What we really want is a principled way of bringing these things together, and that's where I think we should be putting our effort. And putting them together doesn't necessarily mean equal weight. It doesn't, there's, I think, a whole universe of ways in which you can imagine, let's say broadly speaking, putting together things like neural networks that track distributions in some way, with things like symbolic AI that can do a bunch of inferences and operations of the variables and so forth.
Yeah, I mainly heard Karl was right, and that's how it always ends. We have a couple of minutes left, maybe if there's an urgent question from the audience. And Pablo, go for it.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for the discussion. I think it's very interesting. First of all, I have to say I don't use ChatGPT, I don't use Cloud, I don't use any generative AI for programming. I hire people for that. No, but I wanted to say one important thing. If
a man who cares about the quality of his results.
So, no, I wanted to say that if you go back to Moravec paradox and all these things that he said are way impossible to solve, we are solving it. I mean, maybe not the right way that you want it, but language has been cracked somehow by statistical analysis. So, and this is kind of a result, right? So we are seeing that our machines talking, solving the Turing test, and this is very important. Even if you can criticize.
Solving the Turing test is not at all important. I'll let you finish your question, but I
it was
object to
important
that.
in the 60s at least, right?
Say again?
It was important in the 60s at least, right?
It was important in 1950. I just went to, I mean, if we're going to pause there, I just was part of the 75th anniversary of Turing Test Symposium at the Royal Society. Alan Kay spoke, I spoke, some people dissected the test in great detail. The whole thing is available on YouTube. We spoke for 7 hours. Not one person in those 7, and Dermot Turing was the last speaker. He's Turing's nephew. Not one person defended the test in modern form. We all agreed that it was nice to open the discussion about what thinking is and could a machine do it, but we also all agreed that that test is really a test of human gullibility and how you could fool people. And we all agreed that we've known that since 1965 with the advent of ELIZA, which fooled a lot of people and contributed nothing to the understanding of intelligence, literally zero. The same thing with a system called Eugene Guzman that was arguably the first to win the Turing test. Nobody would ever look to Eugene Guzman's techniques for anything except how to fool people.
Yeah, but so just to conclude, if you can criticize it as you don't want, that the way to solve AI as you want, so that we do to understand cognition, but it is right that it's working. So, and this is something that we have to take into
All right, I'm going to go after your second premise too.
So let me rephrase it. People are using it. People are using it hardcore. So this is happening. So people are using it as another computational element in their lives. So it's a complement to our intelligence. So this is happening. So we cannot say that.
Is there a question in there?
Well, I'm just saying that we can criticize it.
That's not a question. So I'm going to respond now since it's not a question. Yes, people, I'm going to derive a question from your not question, which is, what do you make of the fact that people are using it? How does that relate to the rest of the conversation? So yes, people are using it, sometimes successfully, sometimes no. There was an MIT study that showed 95% of companies using it are not getting return on investment. There was a study by Meter showing that productivity was actually cut in coders who were sure that it was going to help. So results are mixed, but some people are genuinely getting utility out of it. Not, however, universally. And there's a set of problems that works really well, and there's a set that doesn't. Like, people are sticking them into robots, but nobody knows how to make a robotic plumber. Like, there are lots of things that we have no idea right now how to use these things for. These things are not that great at science unless a lot of scientists spend a lot of time carefully constraining them to do a particular problem. You just throw into a chatbot and say, solve cancer for me. You're not going to get any throw into an LLM, you're not going to get anything out of it that is useful. So there are things that are useful for, and there are things that are not. One of my favorite quotes in cognitive science is from Chaz Firestone and Brian Scholl, two cognitive psychologists, and I can almost do it from memory. They say cognition is not one thing but many. And they go on to give a bunch of different examples. I don't remember all of the examples. But the point is that there are many different facets of intelligence. In fact, I'm co-author on a paper with Yasho Bengio and 30 other people. Dan Hendricks is the lead author. That came out yesterday. I think the website is agidefinition.ai. And the point of the paper, which is not entirely successful, I criticized my own paper in my own Substack yesterday, it's not entirely successful, but what it tries to do is to fractionate cognition into a bunch of different things. And there's a nice little graph in there where there are 10 aspects of cognition that they look at based on a classic framing of cognition from Cattell. You can find lots of others. That's part of my critique. But on that, you could say very reasonably LLMs are good at 3 or 4 of these, and not so good at 7 of them or something like that, 6 or 7 of them. So they are useful because they do certain parts of cognition well. They are much less useful than you could imagine AI to be, because there are many aspects of cognition that they don't do well. So thermostats, which are the world's most primitive agents, as we just learned. And you can actually make that argument. Thermostats are useful, right? And they do an intelligent thing, which is they determine the temperature and they control the temperature in a room. They are a bit of intelligence by some definition. You could argue they have a semantics and argue that LLMs don't have a semantics if you really want to have some fun. But they're limited. They do some things and not others. We should take another question.
We're actually at time, but let's take an actual question.
So my question is about agency. Sorry. So I think the lack of agency also creates some of the problems in the LLM we see today. Like GPT-5 made a lot of mistakes, but you cannot threaten and say, if you keep making mistakes, I'm going to replace you with GPT-6 because.
Well, you can tell it that. It won't make any difference.
Exactly, because it doesn't have agency. You cannot take agency away from it.
I'll let Karl answer too, but my view is that that's not the core problem for why LLMs don't reason well. The core problem is they don't have world models, they don't have a proper semantics, they don't have abstract representation. It's not a motivational question. I mean, they kind of do what you're telling them, or they try to do it. They don't really understand any of it. They're all just doing pattern matching over language. Something that I find hilarious, and then I'll turn it over to Mike, is that the world that we have wound up in is one where everybody in machine learning, I'm exaggerating, many people in machine learning have a violent aversion to putting any innate structure in their models, versus AI, to its credit, does not. But most of them do. But then they put all this innate stuff in their system prompts. That's actually innate. The system didn't learn what's in the system prompt. Some engineer tried a bunch of stuff out and did a bunch of experiments and said, let's build that in. That's more like evolution than learning. They're building that thing in after saying that they hate innateness, after dumping on me for saying we need innateness. They stick it in the system prompt. But what's even more embarrassing, or maybe equally embarrassing, is that you say stuff like, don't hallucinate in your system prompt. Like Apple literally had that. Does anybody remember the Apple BBC News summary debacle? Like it literally said, don't hallucinate, and it hallucinated anyway. So like, you're talking to a wall, and telling the wall don't hallucinate doesn't really work.
Very good entertainment value.
I try.
So to briefly responding to this, I think one has to acknowledge that sort of from an engineering perspective, large language models are beautiful. I mean, they are a really impressive bit of engineering. And it's interesting to know why are they so beautiful? Why do we find them so alluring? Because it's not the RL part of it that makes them so compelling. Because the objective function is just prediction. It's just predicting the statistics very much like a sort of ordering code in time. So I think that's interesting to note. It's not reinforcement learning that's sort of realized the beauty that we witness with large language models. It's the use of universal function approximators to do prediction, basically. But and I think that's the key thing, it's just predicting stuff that we do. So I think it's the fact that generative AI just generates a kind of stuff that we generate that renders them beautiful and interesting. But beyond that, there is no utility.
In other words, Karl has told you today, and I'm not fully endorsing, LLMs are rubbish and they are parasites.
Yes. We have one final question, and then we can.
It's a two-parter. The first part is, I'm curious whether you have agreement on the kinds of systems that, like Tim, you've been working on, could be, and have been developing, could be considered to be a kind of neurosymbolic AI. And the other is, so the question of do language models have a world model or not? So I'm currently organizing a special issue of Royal Society. Yuri's contributed a really excellent article on the topic of world models. But the question is like, is it something of a suitcase where we need to unpack? And maybe there's multiple kinds of world models that are differently meaningful. I guess rather than is there one kind of world model or not, how would people feel about there being like a typology of world models? And do you think it would be possible to come to agreement on this?
Taking the last part first, no. Unlikely that we will come to agreement. I think a typology is actually a good thing and a worthwhile project. I just wrote a piece for my Substack about, I forget the title, but basically how the complete lack of world models was undermining LLMs. And the example that I gave, and I'll come to your point about multiple definitions, was that you can't take an LLM and have it reliably play a game of chess. And there's a really interesting pattern of behavior, which is an LLM can repeat the rules of chess. It can even answer questions like, can a queen jump over a knight? But then it will actually have a queen jump over a knight illegally when it plays. And so my argument there, and I will admit that there are different ways you can construct the term, but my argument there is it has not made a model of chess. This is despite being trained on millions of games that are there on the internet, being trained on the rules which are in Wikipedia and chess.com, being trained on books like Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess, which is where I learned how to play a decent game of chess and so forth. That's all there, and it doesn't actually absorb it. So for me, I would want to say if you can't do that, you don't really have a world model even of chess. And in fact, LLMs have been beaten by an Atari 2600 from 1975 with its cartridge from 1975 in chess. And so the Atari 2600 does have a world model of chess in the sense that I'm defining. I'm open to the fact that other people talk about it in different ways, and we talked about that a moment ago. There's this function prediction sense, and I think that carefully articulating all of that might have some value. Like there's the sense that I'm describing where you have an interrogable system. You can ask it questions like, can queens jump over knights? You can expect that it will behave in a coherent and consistent way with those things that it repeats. So do LLMs have coherent world models? As I'm describing, clearly not. But are they predictive functions? Well, you could make that argument. I mean, what does it mean if you get the predictions wrong? But you could get into that. I think it would be a service to the field to try to spell that out more carefully.
Any closing word, Karl?
Well, actually, I don't think I need to. I think I agree entirely. But
See, he agrees with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I always do covertly, but never want to too explicit about it, so I'll get into trouble. But I do think if the question was, do we have a need for an ontology of world models? I certainly think that'd be really useful. I'll just make the obvious point that, of course, each artifact and each person, any instance of intelligence will have its own world model fit for purpose for the world and the niche and the content with which it has to exchange. But there seems to be a sort of deeper thing here, which is the distinction between the implicit world model in a current generative AI, which is, I repeat, much more sort of, so in the universal function approximation sort of analogy, I was implying a mapping from content to content or consequence to consequence. To me, that is a very different kind of model, typology, speaking, from a mapping from cause to content, consequence. So I think these are fundamentally different approaches to dynamics, intelligence, agency, however you want to frame it. So I think it would be useful to have that fundamental distinction in play. And I see this distinction in many other fields, and it may be useful just to sort of reinforce that. So you've got a commitment to either this kind of descriptive model, this consequence to consequence or content to content mapping, or you've got a commitment to the true kind of understanding world models and implicit and symbolic concepts.
And I will end on a note of agreement and with a reference to something else, because I think we have to wrap up. I agree with everything that Karl just said, and we didn't mention Yuta Karl's stuff on causality, his ladder of causality, but it's very consistent with this, the 3 runs of causality. it's not framed in quite the same language, but really world models are core to what he's saying as well, and it's exactly consistent with what Karl is saying. You don't want to just learn correlations between content. You want to have a world model that intervenes, that you're doing causal analysis over. So Karl agrees with me, I agree with Karl, and we thank you very much.